This video is going to answer a question I'm being asked more and more often, which is how to keep ladybugs eating aphids in your garden. I'm David Spencer. Welcome to Gardening with Bugs. Ladybugs are fantastic predators. They clean up aphid hotspots. The problem is their life cycle is very long. So yes, they'll show up as adults in your yard sort of mid to late spring, and they'll be laying eggs in those high aphid populations. But it isn't until much later in the summer, it can be longer than 8 weeks, before those eggs have eventually become the adults that you see now populating your garden. So there's a lot of other predators that are really picking up the slack, like preventing aphids from establishing on some of your plants. That's not always the case with ladybugs. It's really the ladybug larva that's been laid and can't really leave that plant that you're going to see the greatest reduction of aphids from. The adults can eat somewhere like 5,000 aphids in their adult lifespan, but the larvae are really going to clean up and stick around. The adults tend to graze, they'll eat a few, lay eggs where they know that their larva will have enough aphids to survive, and then they move on. So what's really essential for keeping ladybugs interested is, of course, high aphid populations. So I'm going to tell you right now that if you want ladybugs, you have to keep the aphids in your yard. And I know that sounds counterintuitive. The fact that you want something gone, I'm going to tell you to keep it, but that'll make sense in a second. No one's telling you to allow aphids to damage your plants, like your roses or something that you're very concerned about having stunted growth or the spread of disease and viruses, all of which aphids can do. If there's plants that you are concerned about aphids being on, of course, just spray them off with water, squish them with your finger, or buy beneficial insects that'll help knock the population down faster. Don't use sprays and soaps and all that. I've said this a million times, but that will prevent the predators from showing up just because of the smell and the interaction with the plant. So if you have to get them off of one of your plants, then do so immediately. But that's not really what this is about. This is about keeping them in your yard. So of course you have that plant you want to take care of. That doesn't mean you can't establish aphids elsewhere in your yard. So consider this: professional growers sometimes use aphid banker plants. And what that is in our industry is typically a grass or a grain plant, like literally wheat or rye grown in a container. Now they infest that with the oat aphid, which is a non-transferable aphid. So that aphid cannot do damage to plants that are not in the grass family. So if you're growing pansies or hanging baskets or peppers and you're worried about aphids in your greenhouse, you can of course have this aphid colony of the oat aphid. It doesn't matter how big it is, it's not going to do anything to your plant. Now the theory there is the predators will come in, establish and multiply on the oat aphid, and eventually spread into your crop. And in practice that does work sometimes, although in most cases it's better just to send beneficials into the crop that has aphids to begin with. But it's that principle that you can use in your yard. So let me walk you through a couple plants that have similar properties that you can use as a banker plant for aphids. Now remember, it's the high aphid populations that are needed to sustain ladybugs. So you do have to have a lot of aphids. Now I'm growing a whole bunch of vegetables. So I have a lot of cole crops or brassicas. Things like kale, broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage. Now, if you weren't doing that, if you have an ornamental garden, just lots of flowers and stuff like that, then consider that family of plants one of your first banker plants, because it will get the cabbage aphid, which is a teal-looking aphid, or kind of grayish, usually quite compact, like they stay together in a tight formation. Now, that can only infect those plants and their cousins, the families that include all the mustards and turnips as well. So if you're not growing those plants, you can always, and it is ornamental, you could do things like the ornamental kale or even this flowering mustard, this yellow mustard. It just has a backdrop flower, which will get these aphids and it will encourage these predators to show up. Similarly, lupins get the lupin aphid. That's another non-transferable aphid. So you can have lupins. If they get the aphid, don't worry, those aphids are not going to spread into the rest of your garden because they cannot infect any other plants, but you will get aphid predators, including ladybugs, established on the lupin. Now, not all plants are suitable for the predators, and this is just, we only know the tip of the iceberg for this information, but sometimes when I'm releasing beneficial insects in commercial growers, they'll work perfectly well in one greenhouse and not so much in another one, and we find out that it might even be a variation of a plant, like how tight the hairs are, something that's prohibiting them, or sometimes the smell. So while I mentioned the cabbage aphid, you'll get a lot of predators. Ladybugs don't particularly like that, and you'll rarely see the eggs on it. But here's one that ladybugs absolutely love, which I encourage you to try out, and that's the hop. So here are my hops. I grew them for shade because they die back to the ground every winter, so I get all the sun I want then, and then they grow to a massive plant. They grow a couple feet a day in some cases, so they can quickly shade an area. Now the aphids love them, so much so that this area was the greatest hop producing area in the British Empire at one point before the hop aphid got so bad that the industry collapsed. So the hop aphid is here violently, but the ladybugs love this plant. So what I see in my yard is, first of all, the cherry gets that black aphid, which does spread unfortunately, but that's the first place I see the ladybugs. Now if it wasn't for the hops, well, all the rest of the aphid populations that I see throughout my yard are still small, and so you don't see as many ladybugs as much as some of the other predators that work a little bit quicker, except on the hop. So without that hop, I wouldn't have this continuation of ladybugs from the cherry to the hop. So I encourage you to do this one. It does have alternative hosts, potentially cannabis and stinging nettle, but in most cases, that shouldn't be a problem for you. And even so, cannabis is not proven that that's the hop aphid. It's very similar to the cannabis aphid, but they could be entirely different, and nobody cares too much about their stinging nettle. Now, just like the banker plant example with the oat aphid on grains, you can, of course, grow grains in your yard. I've grown wheat and rye and barley and oats in my yard, and they do get the oat aphid. And it's not, of course, that's not going to spread. It doesn't actually do much damage to the grain. I mean, commercially for farmers, they can measure the loss of yield because of this aphid, but for me, I'm just going to let it dry out and harvest it by hand anyways, or just toss the seeds to the birds. So it really doesn't matter. It's a fun plant to grow, and of course, the aphid predators will be on that plant as well. Now, if you're brave, you're not going to upset your neighbors, and you want to take this to the next level, you can produce and try to encourage the aphids that do spread to other plants. Now, bear with me, but it's almost impossible as soon as you've tried to keep an aphid population without being fed upon to keep that going for any length of time. I know that professionally because I have to keep populations of aphids in order to maintain aphid predators, and even in cages it's sometimes impossible with chemicals, with cages, with all sorts of things. So if you were to take a plant in your yard and decide this is where I'm going to maintain and establish aphids, I'm not going to let anything wipe them out, you will fail. And because of that principle, you can plant things that are notoriously bad for aphids, like nasturtium, which gets the black aphid, which does spread. But you can grow that in a place where you know it doesn't matter if that nasturtium looks terrible, because I'm going to grow it somewhere no one's going to see it and I don't need to worry about it. But it will still attract predators. So similarly, I do things with this bread poppy. I'm just growing it for the poppy seeds, which are delicious, especially fresh. And of course the flower looks nice, so I really couldn't care less if the leaves are covered in aphids. And it is this black aphid, and it does transfer, but it just absolutely attracts some of the other predators. And sunflowers are notoriously beneficial for your garden. If there's any plant I wish for you to grow, it's sunflowers, and that's for all sorts of reasons. But talking about aphids, they do get aphids, several different species of them, but just like hops, the predators love them, and it might be a texture or a smell of the leaf, but you'll see that these plants are absolutely crawling with especially ants, but all sorts of other insects as well. So try to establish sunflowers in your yard. There's extra floral nectaries which feed things like butterflies and the ants. You do want to trap the ants if you're using this to establish aphids and the predators, but it's really a beneficial plant for your yard. Now don't forget, when we talk about establishing ladybugs in the yard and keeping them in here feeding, we're not talking about buying them, because when you buy them, unless it's a lab reared one, you're getting Hippodamia convergens, which is from an overwintering site. And Cornell University did look at buying these refrigerated ladybugs and seeing if they could make them stay in the yard, because they don't. As soon as you release them, they have to go back to where they've hibernated. It's a chemical necessity that they need to do this. So they did find a way to trick them into staying, but it took several weeks in a lab of like different light, temperature, and diet regimes in order to basically knock that urge to migrate and hibernate out of them. And the result of that trial was that it was not cost effective whatsoever, and wasn't a suitable process. So when we talk about ladybugs, we're talking about the ones that are already here, which do include the Hippodaemia convergens, which will find their way back to your yard every year anyways. But there's hundreds of species that are in your yard. Remember, the different colors and spots sometimes mean completely different species. Unfortunately, to complicate it, sometimes the exact species can have different variations on their patterns and color, which is just like a biotype or variety. But really, there's hundreds of kinds, so you don't need to go out and buy any. They are here, they do overwinter. And lastly, what we always talk about is where are these guys going to overwinter, and can I keep them so that they emerge in my yard specifically earlier, or at least in greater numbers each year. And really that falls down to plant material. So if you're quick to bare earth your garden in the fall, mulch it or something like that, like yes, you're reducing habitat, but in a place like where I am, it doesn't really matter. They'll find a place in the woods, in the yards, in the hedges, and all that kind of stuff. So unless you're in suburbia and you've got a lot of lawn, and you really want to keep that yard looking tidy, then you will run into the case of not having a lot of habitat for them. But don't go buying ladybug structures and stuff like that. They've never been proven to be effective whatsoever. If you want to, you could maybe get lucky, but really they're as likely to pupate or overwinter on your windowsill than they are in these store-bought houses. Lastly, a little disclaimer, when I say this is how we manage aphids, part of that is the understanding that there will always be aphids. So you have to have a bit of tolerance for the fact that they do exist here. But that's the principle of what I do here, is I allow these aphids to establish. I don't care if they move around, as long as they're not getting to the point of really damaging plants, like hurting growing tips or spreading disease that becomes noticeable. I can just manage it really by doing nothing. So I'm just giving you a couple tips to sort of to bend everything in your favor. But by doing nothing, like yes, you'll get a cherry tree that's absolutely covered in aphids, but it will recover. Your hop will look absolutely disgusting at some point, and then once the ladybug eggs have all hatched, it'll quickly be cleaned up. There'll still be some aphids, but it'll never be a problem. It won't be dripping honeydew, and it won't look like a disaster like it did a few weeks before. And again, things like roses, you don't necessarily want those aphids on those buds because you're growing it presumably for the flowers. So those are the ones where you do probably want to squish the aphids or just blast them off gently with water only. So I hope these tips have helped you out. I encourage you, like I said, the sunflower, but I encourage you to grow hops. If you don't have a giant trellis, you're not going to grow it for shade. You can just throw it in the yard somewhere. It's a vine, so it winds up on fences or and even other plants as well. And it really will sustain populations of aphid predators in your yard. And that's the key to this discussion today.